The world is on fire right now, and I mean that almost literally. We are living through one of the most consequential geopolitical moments since the end of the Cold War. And most people scrolling through their phones have no idea how interconnected all of this is. How every single thread, from the price of jet fuel in Europe, to the pension payments of Ukrainian soldiers, to the 57% of Canadians who now want to join the European Union, runs back to one central unraveling. So sit down, because we are going to go through all of it today. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do that right now. Hit the like button, drop a comment telling me what you think about any of this, because I want to hear from you, and your engagement genuinely helps this kind of independent journalism reach more people. Let us start with the biggest story on the planet right now. The United States and Israel launched coordinated military operations against Iran beginning on February 28, 2026. That is a date that is going to be in history books. We initiated, and I want to be very clear about the use of that word we, a war against another sovereign nation in the Middle East. And before you tune out, before your eyes glaze over, because this region has been in conflict for so long that some people have become numb to it, I want you to understand what is actually different this time and why it touches your life directly, whether you realize it or not. As of today, April 22nd, 2026, we are technically in a ceasefire with Iran. But let me tell you what that ceasefire actually looks like, because calling it fragile would be extraordinarily generous. Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, and again, a sitting president of the United States is using a social media platform he personally owns to conduct foreign policy. Let that sink in, that he will extend the ceasefire with Iran until its leaders, quote, can come up with a unified proposal. Meanwhile, the United States naval blockade of Iran's ports continues. So we are in a ceasefire in the sense that the bombs have temporarily stopped falling, but we are maintaining an economic and military stranglehold on a nation of nearly 90 million people. Under international law, specifically under the United Nations Charter Article 2, Paragraph 4, a naval blockade is itself an act of war. So the ceasefire is not really a ceasefire. It is a pause in kinetic action while the economic suffocation continues. And the peace talks? This is where it gets almost absurd. Pakistan has stepped up as the mediator, hosting potential negotiations between the United States and Iran in Islamabad. Trump, to his credit, in terms of rhetoric at least, said he was positive about the talks and that Iran had, quote, no choice but to send a delegation. The problem is that by the time evening fell in Islamabad, the Iranians still had not confirmed whether they were actually going to show up. Pakistan's own information minister publicly warned that Iran's decision before the ceasefire deadline was, and I'm quoting directly here, critical. And confirming just how chaotic this entire diplomatic situation is, Vice President J.D. Vance was reportedly supposed to travel to Pakistan for these talks, and then a White House official confirmed he was not going at all. So we are coordinating the most consequential peace negotiation in decades, with the same level of logistical coherence as planning a birthday party that might not happen. And while all of this diplomatic chaos is unfolding, this morning the United States intercepted and boarded an oil tanker called the Tiffany in the Indian Ocean. The ship sails under the flag of Botswana, but has been under American sanctions since July of 2025 as part of the Iran sanctions program. The State Department stated that this vessel had twice loaded Iranian petroleum through ship-to-ship transfers. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. We are boarding ships in the Indian Ocean. That is a projection of military force thousands of miles from American shores. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the president is required to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing United States forces to a military engagement. Has that been happening consistently? Has Congress been meaningfully consulted on any of the operational decisions being made in this war? These are questions that should be screaming from every front page in this country, and instead we are getting horse race coverage of approval ratings. Speaking of approval ratings, a fresh Reuters and Ipsos poll shows Trump's support has dropped to 36%. That is the lowest point of his second term. And honestly, I understand it. When you start a war and jet fuel prices spike past $100 a barrel, and we will get to that in a moment, and the grocery store still costs a fortune, and you are telling people that tariffs are going to bring back prosperity, but General Motors alone is projecting $3 to $4 billion in tariff costs in its 2026 financial guidance. The American working class is going to feel all of that in their bank accounts, whether the administration admits it or not. Now, let us talk about what this war has done to the global economy, because the International Monetary Fund, which is not some left-wing think tank, this is the institution that effectively governs global financial stability, released its April 2026 World Economic Outlook, and the numbers are stark. Global growth is projected to slow to 3.1% this year, down from 3.4% in 2025. They specifically identify the Iran war as a, quote, global negative supply shock. Oil prices are now assumed to average $82.22 per barrel this year, up from $67.74 in 2025. That is a significant jump, and it flows directly into everything from the cost of shipping goods across oceans to the price of plastics to the price of food. The IMF also issued a warning that if more countries respond to American tariff policies by adopting their own protectionist measures, which, by the way, is exactly what is happening, the compounding effect would further drag down global growth. We are not just in a shooting war, we are in an economic war. simultaneously on multiple fronts. Now let us look at what this has meant for Europe, because the European picture is important, and it is not being covered nearly enough in American media. European airlines are preparing for what they are describing as a deeply challenging spring and summer season. Jet fuel prices have risen to well over $100 a barrel since the Iran conflict began, and one analysis found that fuel costs alone have risen by an average of $104 per passenger on long-haul flights out of Europe. The European Union is set to respond with new guidelines on managing limited jet fuel supply. But guidelines are not supply. You cannot regulate oil into existence. What the Europeans are grappling with is the downstream consequence of a military conflict they had no vote in and no say over. But here is where Europe's story gets even more interesting and, frankly, more consequential in the long term. French President Emmanuel Macron and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk met in Gdansk on April 20th, and their agenda included a genuinely extraordinary topic: the possibility of extending France's nuclear deterrent to cover Poland and potentially other European countries. Think about what that means. France is the only European Union member state with an independent nuclear arsenal. The fact that they are publicly discussing extending that deterrent, not through NATO, not through the United States, but bilaterally, tells you everything about how European leaders currently assess American reliability as a security partner. This is a tectonic shift in the post-World War II security architecture, and it is happening quietly while everyone is looking at the Middle East. And if you want to understand why European leaders are thinking this way, look no further than Canada. The tariff war between the United States and Canada has already reduced Canadian gross domestic product by an estimated 1.5 to 2%. Canadian households are absorbing an estimated $1,700 to $2,000 in higher annual costs because of these tariffs. And the polling result that genuinely stunned me when I read it: approximately 57% of Canadians either support or somewhat support the idea of Canada joining the European Union as a full member Canada. Joining the European Union. That is not a real legal possibility today. Canada is not geographically part of Europe, and the European Union's accession rules under Article 49 of the Treaty on European Union require that member states be European nations. But the fact that a majority of Canadians are even entertaining the concept tells you something profound about how thoroughly the United States has damaged its relationship with its closest neighbor and oldest trading partner. We did not just start a trade war with Canada. We made millions of Canadians want to leave our orbit entirely. Now, I want to spend some real time on the Middle East more broadly, because the Iran conflict is not happening in isolation. It is layered on top of an already catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza and the West Bank, and the Iran war is actively making that situation worse by pulling international attention away from it. The United Nations Commission of Inquiry specifically warned that the US and Israeli operations against Iran have eclipsed a surge in human rights violations against Palestinians. In Gaza, Israeli airstrikes, shelling, and drone attacks have continued, with at least 200 people killed since February 28th alone. The overall death toll in the Gaza war as of early April stands at least 75,498 people reported killed, including over 73,000 Palestinians and more than 2,000 Israelis. And let me be precise. Those numbers come from the Gaza Health Ministry and the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, respectively. This is not contested data from advocacy groups. These are official figures. In the West Bank, the situation is deteriorating separately and almost entirely out of the global news cycle. More than 2,500 Palestinians have been displaced by demolitions, settler attacks, and evictions in 2026 alone. And that includes more than 1,100 children. Settler attacks now account for 75% of all displacement recorded this year. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the transfer of a civilian population by an occupying power is a war crime. I am not editorializing there. That is the text of the law. Article 49 is explicit, and yet the United States continues to provide political cover and military hardware, while our own government is consumed by the Iran ceasefire negotiations that may or may not be happening in Pakistan. The one potentially significant development out of Gaza came on April 19th, when two Hamas officials indicated the group was prepared to hand over thousands of automatic rifles and other weapons used by its police force and internal security services. That is being described as a disarmament signal. I am cautiously skeptical because we have been here before, with near breakthroughs that fell apart, but it is worth watching closely. If it is genuine, it opens a very narrow diplomatic window that someone would need to have the wisdom and credibility to walk through. And right now, the United States does not appear to have either. Let us talk about China, because Beijing has been absolutely playing chess, while Washington plays checkers this entire time. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense confirmed the passage of China's Liaoning aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait on April 20th, with a missile destroyer accompanying it the day before. Let me be direct about what this is. China's military leadership is watching the United States stretched across a Middle East conflict, diplomatically scrambling to prevent a full resumption of war with Iran, and they are sailing an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait as a deliberate signal. Under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, the United States is obligated to provide Taiwan with defensive arms and to maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force. But capacity to resist requires actual military and diplomatic bandwidth, and right now, that bandwidth is being consumed in the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, Russia's oil exports to China increased by 31% in the first quarter of 2026, exceeding 31.8 million tons. Russia and China are deepening what is effectively a sanctions-resistant economic axis. Russia is selling China natural gas at approximately $259 per thousand cubic meters, which is more than 38% below the price offered to remaining European buyers. Think about that. Russia is subsidizing China's industrial economy while using energy as a weapon against Europe, and it is working. And speaking of using energy as a weapon, Russia has announced it intends to stop transit of oil from Kazakhstan to Germany via the Druzhba pipeline starting May 1st, 2026. The Druzhba pipeline is one of the longest pipeline systems in the world, and it has historically been a major supply route for Central European refineries. Cutting that transit is not a casual business decision. It is a deliberate escalation designed to tighten energy pressure on Europe at the exact moment when jet fuel costs are already crushing European airlines and when European governments are being asked to continue financing Ukraine's defense. Ukraine's situation deserves direct attention because it is severe and getting worse. Chinese media analysis, and look, I cite Chinese state media analysis with full awareness of its bias, but this particular assessment has been corroborated by independent economic modeling, suggests that without emergency budget injections, Ukraine could run out of money for pensions, the military, and critical imports by June. By June, the Ukrainian economy is under pressure from every direction. The ongoing war, reduced Western aid, and now the global oil price shock from the Iran conflict cutting into whatever economic activity was still functioning. The United States poured enormous political capital and financial resources into supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression, and we may be watching that investment collapse while we are focused on a different conflict. And Beijing, beyond its military signaling and its economic partnership with Moscow, is facing its own structural vulnerability that is worth noting. China is confronting an acute shortage of helium, which is a critical input for semiconductor manufacturing and for medical MRI scanners. This matters because it creates a pressure point in China's technological ambitions that did not exist 2 years ago. The global helium market is dominated by a small number of suppliers, primarily the United States, Qatar, and Russia. And the current geopolitical realignment is disrupting those supply chains in ways that are going to have long-term consequences for the global semiconductor industry. Now let us bring this back home, because the domestic political situation in the United States is inextricably linked to all of this. Trump's pick to lead the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, appeared before a Senate committee this week for confirmation hearings. The Federal Reserve's independence is not just a procedural nicety. Under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the Fed is designed to operate with insulation from direct political pressure, precisely because monetary policy decisions, interest rates, inflation management, emergency liquidity facilities need to be made on economic grounds rather than political ones. The ongoing confirmation fight and the forces beyond Warsh's control that could derail it are a signal that even the institutional framework designed to stabilize the economy is under stress. Meanwhile, Democratic Representative Sheila Shaffilis McCormick announced she would resign from Congress after facing an expulsion threat tied to more than 24 alleged ethics violations. I want to say something about this that I think a lot of progressive commentators are reluctant to say accountability has to apply regardless of party affiliation. If a Republican member of Congress were facing 24 alleged ethics violations and an expulsion threat, progressive media would be covering it wall to wall. The same standard has to apply here. The Democratic Party cannot credibly present itself as an alternative to corruption and dysfunction if it does not police its own ranks with the same vigor it demands of the other side. So let me give you my analysis of where all of this is headed, because I think the picture is actually clearer than the day-to-day chaos suggests. What we are watching is the accelerated fragmentation of the post-World War II international order. The rules-based international system built on institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, collective security arrangements through NATO and other alliances is cracking simultaneously at multiple points. The United States initiating a war with Iran without a formal declaration of war from Congress, the last time Congress formally declared war was in 1942, represents a continuation of executive overreach that has been building since at least the Korean War and has now reached a kind of culmination. The War Powers Resolution has been effectively ignored by every president since it was passed in 1973. That is a bipartisan failure that has now landed us here. The Iran ceasefire, even if it holds, and even if peace talks in Pakistan produce some kind of framework agreement, is not going to restore the status quo ante. Iran has been bombed. Its infrastructure has been damaged. Its population has been traumatized. Whatever government emerges from this crisis, whether the current leadership survives politically or not, is going to have a profound and lasting antipathy toward American power that will shape the region for a generation. We have seen this movie before. We saw it in Iraq, where the 2003 invasion that was supposed to produce a democratic and friendly government in the heart of the Middle East instead produced years of insurgency, the creation of the Islamic State, in a country that now has deep economic and political ties to Iran. We saw it in Libya. We have a historical record to consult here, and the record is not encouraging. Israel's position is the most complex piece of this entire puzzle. Israel is a military ally of the United States, and the joint operations against Iran were framed as a response to Iranian support for proxy forces that have attacked Israel. I understand that framing, and I take seriously the legitimate security concerns of Israeli citizens who have been living under the threat of Iranian-backed rocket fire and terrorist attacks for years. But I also cannot look at a death toll of more than 73,000 Palestinians in Gaza, at 2,500 newly displaced people in the West Bank in 2026 alone, at 75% of all displacement this year being caused by settler attacks, not military operations, and pretend that these are proportionate responses to security threats. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, to which over 120 nations are signatories, defines the forcible transfer of population as a crime against humanity under Article 7. These are not fringe positions. These are mainstream international legal standards. Russia's playing a long game, and Vladimir Putin is playing it with extraordinary cold-bloodedness. Every week that the United States is consumed by the Iran conflict is a week that Russian forces consolidate positions in Ukraine. Every percentage point that oil prices rise above the pre-war baseline is additional revenue flowing into the Russian state budget. Every new pipeline shutdown directed at European buyers is another step toward making Europe more economically desperate and therefore more politically pliant. Putin does not need to win on every front simultaneously. He just needs to outlast the attention span and the financial capacity of his opponents. And right now, that strategy appears to be working. China's strategy is even more patient. Beijing is watching all of this with what I imagine is a combination of genuine alarm at the chaos and cold strategic calculation about the opportunities it creates. A United States bogged down in a Middle East ceasefire that may collapse at any moment, with an approval rating of 36%, with its closest neighbor considering a political reorientation toward Europe, with its Federal Reserve in a confirmation fight, with Congress distracted by ethics scandals, that United States is not in a strong position to enforce the Taiwan Relations Act if Beijing decides the moment is right to make a move across the Taiwan Strait. I am not predicting that will happen. I am saying that the signals from Beijing's recent military movements suggest they are, at minimum, conducting a detailed assessment of American resolve and capacity, and that assessment is happening right now. And Canada, I want to come back to Canada because this story is genuinely underreported. The fact that 57% of Canadians are open to joining the European Union is not just a polling curiosity. It reflects a fundamental reorientation of Canadian national identity away from North American integration and toward European-style social democracy. Canadians look at the United States right now, and they see a country that imposed punishing tariffs on its closest ally, that is fighting a war in the Middle East without clear legal authorization, that has a president posting foreign policy on a social media platform he owns, and they are making a rational judgment that their national interests are better served by closer alignment with Europe. That should alarm every single American regardless of party, because a fragmented North American alliance weakens everyone in this hemisphere. The bottom line is this: we are in a genuinely multipolar moment where American dominance, the kind of dominance that shaped the entire international order for 80 years after World War II, is being actively challenged, and not just by adversaries, but by allies and neighbors. The tools that the United States has historically used to maintain that dominance, military force, economic sanctions, diplomatic credibility, are all being deployed simultaneously and at scale, which means the margin for error is extremely thin. If the Iran ceasefire collapses, if the peace talks in Pakistan produce nothing, if the naval blockade escalates into another incident in the Indian Ocean, the consequences are not theoretical. The IMF has already told us that oil prices at current levels represent a negative supply shock to the entire global economy. What happens at $100 a barrel? At 120? Those are questions that the American public deserves straight answers to, and those answers are not coming from the people currently making the decisions. I have been doing this for a long time, covering the intersection of American foreign policy and domestic politics. And what strikes me most right now is not the complexity of any individual story. It is the compounding simultaneity of all of them: Iran and the ceasefire, Gaza and the death toll, Ukraine and the budget cliff, Russia cutting oil pipelines, China sailing carriers through the Taiwan Strait, Canada polling about the European Union, the Federal Reserve confirmation fight. All of this is happening at the same time, in the same interconnected world, driven by decisions made in Washington that the American people were not adequately consulted on and are now paying for in grocery bills, jet ticket prices, and the slow erosion of the alliances that took generations to build. Pay attention, stay informed, push back when the narrative gets oversimplified. And please, subscribe and hit that like button. Because independent journalism that refuses to both sides its way through a crisis is what we need more of right now, not less. I will be back with more as this develops, because it is going to keep developing very fast.